Long before the hum of electric light touched the horizon of the American West, and before silver screens painted cowboys as champions cloaked in dust and glory, there was silence. Not the kind born of peace, but the low, ceaseless hum of desolation that clung to the land like dry wind to skin. It was in this silence that the true cowboy lived, not the hero of dime novels and cinema, but a man mostly forgotten by history, whose days unfolded in aching solitude beneath an indifferent sky. To most, the cowboy is an image, broad-brimmed, hat, sunburned cheek, revolver holstered at the hip, and a horse kicking up trails of sunset-tinted dust. They see a gallant rider charging through canyons, eyes narrowed against the sun, a lone wolf on a noble quest. But images lie, and in the soft hours of night, when all pretenses fall away, we can begin to understand the quiet truth behind the saddle. This story, dear listener, is not one of heroes. It is a slow-burning recollection of hardship, dust, cold biscuits, and bone-deep fatigue. It is the kind of tale that never made it into ballads sung around fires, for it speaks not of gunfights and gold, but of hunger, cracked leather, and a kind of loneliness that wore through even the toughest hides. This is the story of why it truly sucked to be a cowboy in the Wild West. And it begins, like all honest things do, with a dream. For many young boys growing up in the late 19th century, the open West represented something vast and untamed. A place where they could outrun their past, write their names in the soil, and live free of the confines of eastern factories and crowded tenements. The cattle trail, the open prairie, the long ride beneath a burning sky, it all seemed like liberation. And yet, as they found themselves trading linen shirts for coarse wool and shoes for blistering boots, they would discover that freedom could weigh heavier than any chain. The first illusion to break was comfort. In storybooks, the saddle is a symbol of mastery, of union between man and beast. But in truth, saddles chafed. They pinched skin through worn-out trousers and rubbed sores onto thighs already bruised from days of riding. Leather, dry and cracked from sun and sweat, would stiffen like bark, and there were no cushions out on the plains, just creaking wood and the slow grind of motion that rattled bones and tested endurance. By nightfall, muscles would spasm without warning. Spines stiffened from too many hours in a crooked seat. There were no doctors, no hot baths, no warm feather beds, just the cold earth, and perhaps a blanket if you hadn't lost it to wind or rain. Even horses, the noble steeds of legend, were not always willing partners. Some were half broken, others aging and weak. Cowboys often had to make do with what the rancher provided, and the bond between horse and rider was less of companionship and more a negotiation of endurance. Feed was scarce. Saddlebags had to carry more than grain, so animals often went half-fed, half-watered, just like their riders. A lame horse meant a long walk under a cruel sun, sometimes for days. Then came the chores. Herding cattle sounds romantic, in songs, but in truth, it meant endless days under an unyielding sun, guiding beasts too stubborn to follow. Dust would rise and fill the lungs. Hooves would trample the earth into hard-baked crusts that shattered ankles and jarred knees. Branding. Days were brutal. The stench of scorched hide, the sound of lowing calves, the heat of open fires. It was all a far cry from adventure. There was no schedule to follow, only the whims of weather and herd. Rain could come in torrents, or not at all for weeks. And when it did fall, it soaked through every seam, turning garments into sodden weights and sleep into an impossibility. Lightning lit up the plains like judgment, and many a cowboy died from a strike, their hats still steaming in the aftermath. Yet despite all of this, the myth endured. It was easier to tell tales of duels at high noon than to recount the quiet, despair of losing a boot in the mud, or the agony of an infected blister far from help. Newspapers and novels found no poetry in cracked lips and rotting teeth. Instead, they gave the cowboy a gun, a clean shave, and a clear conscience. But in the hush of real night, the cowboy knew different. He knew the weight of silence, the kind that pressed against his chest in the middle of nowhere. He knew the sorrow of passing homesteads with smoke curling from their chimneys, warmth and family just beyond reach. He knew the loneliness of birthdays forgotten, of letters never received, of the fading memory of a mother's voice. And yet, still he rode. Because the cowboy was not a man of myth, but of persistence. He carried his pain like his saddle, worn, heavy, and essential. He did not chase glory. He chased the next sunrise, the next watering hole, the next brief moment of quiet where the stars hung low and the wind sang of places untouched by men. So let us not remember him as Hollywood does, with silver spurs and perfect hair. Let us remember the real cowboy, with cracked hands, aching bones, and eyes that had seen too much. Let us walk beside him now, one dusty mile at a time, and feel, truly feel, why it was such a sorrowful, noble burden to ride in that forgotten age. And as we begin this long, wandering journey through the heartache of the range, may you find not only sleep, but a quiet kind of reverence for those who bore this life in silence. There is a kind of silence that lives only on the prairie, so complete, so vast, that it ceases to be silence at all. It becomes a weight, draped across the shoulders of the lonely, stretching endlessly into the blue above. For the cowboy, that sky was both a companion and a captor, unmoving, unfeeling, a cathedral with no walls and no prayers that could ever be answered. Each morning, long before the sun touched the rim of the earth, the cowboy rose to this vastness. The stars still hung like scattered dust above him. And in that quiet hour before the world stirred, the size of the land became unbearable. The horizon stretched on without kindness, without change. No trees to break the eye, no mountains to offer shelter, just an ocean of grass and sand and sky, repeating into infinity. At first, the new rider would look upon it with awe. The very thought of so much space seemed to fill the chest with hope. But as days passed, each one identical to the last, that hope began to unravel. For in all its grandeur, the open sky offered no intimacy, no place to rest the soul. There was nowhere to hide from yourself. The cowboy was laid bare beneath it, his every doubt exposed, his every sorrow echoed back to him with cruel clarity. It was not simply the lack of shelter that wore on a man's spirit, but the constancy of it, the way that endlessness devoured meaning. One could ride for 10 hours in any direction and feel as though he hadn't moved at all. The trail curved, the cattle shifted, but the view remained, unchanging, like a cruel jest played by nature. The sun rose, burned, and fell, and then it began again. In such a place, time became elastic. Minutes stretched like taffy, hours bled into one another. There were no clocks save for the shadow of the horse and the hunger in a man's belly. Some cowboys began to speak slower, to think slower, their minds lulled into stillness by the monotony of the range. Others grew restless, jittery, their hands always twitching, their eyes always scanning the horizon for something, anything that might break the spell of nothingness. Many young men, untested and eager, found their spirits dimming after just a few weeks beneath that unyielding dome of blue. They came believing they would find freedom. What they found instead was a kind of solitude that hollowed out the chest. Even the most hardened riders, those with 1,000 miles of trail behind, them confessed in hushed moments around dying fires that the sky had changed them. They spoke of strange dreams, of voices carried on the wind, of memories from childhood resurfacing without warning, old songs, the scent of a mother's cooking, the laughter of siblings long unseen. Some claimed they'd seen figures on the edge of vision, ghosts walking, the horizon. Others simply wept, quietly, into their rolled-up coats when the stars came out, and there was no one to hear. It wasn't just loneliness, it was exposure. The sky saw everything. A cowboy could not weep in secret, nor pray in solitude, without that sky bearing witness. There was no roof, no wall, no corner to curl into. Even in his sleep, the cowboy lay open to the elements. Coyotes might howl, or owls might call, but mostly there was only that stillness, that sky too wide, too high, too far away to ever offer comfort. Some men tried to combat the emptiness with talk. They'd whistle, hum, tell stories aloud to themselves. Others carved notches into their saddles, scratched poems into the bark of solitary trees. They did what they could to mark the passing of time, to remind themselves that they were still alive, still thinking, still tethered to something more than dust and grass. Yet the sky cared nothing for their efforts. And as days slipped into weeks, even these small resistances began to fade. The humming ceased, the stories dried up, a kind of resignation settled into their bones. It was not despair exactly. Rather, it was an acceptance that the world would not change and that their place within it was as fleeting as hoofprints in the sand. Still, the cowboy rode. He followed cattle who followed the wind. He chased sunrises and retreated from storms. He watched clouds drift like forgotten ships across an invisible sea. And in all this, he began to disappear. His name spoken less, his history fading. Some men wrote letters home, pages full of longing, though many had no home left to write to. Others never spoke of their past at all. They became part of the land, silent, hard, and unremarked. There is a strange kind of nobility in that kind of fading. To vanish quietly into the work, to surrender one's ego to the vastness of creation, is something few men can do willingly. Yet the cowboy had no choice. The land demanded it, the sky required it, and so, little by little, they gave themselves away. But sometimes, just before dawn, when the cold clung to the edges of their coats and the stars had not yet fled, a cowboy might look up. And for a moment, feel something like peace, not joy, not relief, but a stillness within the stillness. A knowing that, in this great and endless sky, his breath still rose in steam, his heart still beat beneath leather and wool. He was not known, he was not praised, but he was alive, and for now that had to be enough. In the stories told over campfires and passed down through dusty paperbacks, a cowboy's outfit is treated almost like a suit of armor, sturdy, reliable, suited for the terrain, worn with pride. The hat, the boots, the spurs, they have become symbols, costumes imbued with the spirit of independence and grit. But the truth of those garments, the truth of what it felt like to live in them, day in and day out, was far from the polished picture painted by storytellers and dreamers. There was no standard issue, no tailored fit, no wardrobe waiting with neatly folded shirts. A cowboy wore what he could afford, or more often, what he could scavenge. Gear was rarely new. It was handed down from one man to the next, patched with sinew, frayed at the seams, and stiffened by sweat and weather. Clothing did not express personality. It expressed survival. Let us begin with the boots. Cowboy boots, so celebrated in modern fashion, were not designed for comfort. They were high and stiff to protect legs from brush and snakebite, but that same height trapped heat and rubbed mercilessly against the calves. Most were unlined. Blisters formed within the first day, sometimes bleeding by nightfall. A boot too loose led to instability. A boot too tight crushed the toes and blackened nails until they curled in protest. And still, the cowboy wore them because there were no replacements. In many cases, the boots weren't even a matched pair. A rider might wear one borrowed from a fallen comrade or salvaged from an abandoned post. It was not uncommon to cut open the toe to make space for a swollen foot. On longer drives, the smell of sweat and rot inside the boot became unbearable. Sores grew. Skin sloughed. Some men stuffed wool inside as a buffer, but it only delayed the inevitable, the slow ruin of their own feet. Then there were the shirts and trousers, rarely changed, often slept in. Fabric wore thin in key places, underarms, elbows, knees. Repairs were done with whatever was at hand, horsehair thread, sinew, even rawhide. Shirts were typically wool or rough cotton, thick enough to resist minor scrapes, but impossible in the heat. They trapped sweat, collected dust, and stiffened into near armor by the end of a long ride. In the winter, these same shirts offered pitiful protection against the cold, clinging wetly to the skin and freezing overnight. Many cowboys wore vests, not for style, but for utility. Pockets were precious. A man might carry tobacco, a map, a bit of jerky, or a keepsake, a ribbon from a sweetheart long gone, or a tiny carved figure passed down from his father. These vests were rarely cleaned. The sweat of months darkened. The lining and the scent of smoke and trail dust clung to them like memory. Gloves, when worn, were often fingerless, the tips worn away from reins and rope. A cowboy's hands told his story better than any journal could. They were calloused, split and darkened by sun and grime, fingernails yellowed, then cracked. Rope burns formed white scars across knuckles and palms, and still, the work did not pause. And then, there was the hat. Perhaps no piece of clothing is more iconic. The wide-brimmed cowboy hat, shading eyes, deflecting rain and catching the wind, has become a symbol of rugged grace. But most cowboys did not own elegant Stetsons. Their hats were crude affairs, sweat-stained felt, battered straw, or improvised flaps sewn from canvas and leather. A good hat was a luxury, hard to come by and fiercely guarded. In a storm, it might serve as a makeshift bucket. In the sun, it was your only defense. Many hats bore the marks of their owner's travels, bullet holes from accidents or fights, scorch marks from campfires too close, patches sewn in with mismatched thread. When a man died, his hat often lay beside him, a last marker of who he had been. The bandana, too, was not merely decoration. It shielded the face from dust, wiped sweat from the brow, cleaned wounds, tied up gear, and sometimes, when soaked, offered the only coolness in a parched hour. Cowboys rarely took theirs off, even in sleep. It was, in its own quiet way, a piece of armor against the elements and against despair. Beneath it all were the undergarments, seldom changed, even more seldom washed. Laundry was a rare luxury. Most trails offered no opportunity, and even when water was near, it was saved for drinking, not scrubbing. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Rashes developed and lingered. A man might ride for weeks with infection, crawling just beneath his skin, scratching himself raw in silence. To wear such clothing was not simply an act of necessity, it was an act of endurance. Each item spoke not of strength, but of the price a man paid to remain upright, to complete the drive, to return home, or more often, to drift into the next job. The gear was not noble, it was punishing. And the saddle, let us not forget the saddle. Though not worn upon the body, it shaped a cowboy's every movement. Poorly fitted saddles caused lifelong spinal injuries, crushed nerves, and carved wounds into thighs and hips. The saddle was a tool, a burden, and often the only solid surface a cowboy knew for weeks on end. Some men loved their gear. They polished their buckles, carved initials into the handles of their knives, stitched patches with care. It was, after all, the only thing that remained constant. Horses could die, trails could vanish, friends could move on, but that same tattered coat might ride with you for 10 years through snow, thunder, and sun. Yet even in that constancy, there was no comfort, only familiarity. A reminder, day after day, that the clothes did not make the man. The man made do with the clothes and bore their weight in silence. So next time you see a cowboy painted in oil, standing tall in a crisp vest with spurs shining, remember the truth. Remember the stink of rotting boots, the chafe of wet wool, the lice beneath the collar. Remember the red, raw hands and the aching spine. And remember, above all, that no garment, no matter how revered, can soften the world when the world offers nothing but dust and weariness. There are few hungers more patient than thirst. It creeps in quietly, first as dryness on the tongue, then as a weight in the throat, and slowly it becomes a presence unto itself, gnawing softly at a man's sanity. For the cowboy riding the forgotten trails of the American West, thirst was no rare affliction. It was a companion. It rode beside him each day, sat with him each night, and whispered its slow torture with each breath of hot wind. Water, clean, cool, sufficient, was never guaranteed. The maps of the time showed trails and landmarks, but they could not promise a spring that had not run dry, nor a stream that hadn't been muddied by passing herds. The land was vast and stubborn. It gave nothing freely, and when it came to water, it gave just enough to keep a man desperate. Each cattle drive began with hope. The men would fill their canteens at the last known source, often muddy wells or shallow ponds dark with algae and insects. These canteens, sometimes tin, sometimes leather, were precious things, though rarely insulated against the desert heat. Within hours, the water inside would warm, then turn hot, then taste of metal and mold. Still, it was better than nothing. Much better. As the sun rose and rode the sky like a tyrant, the dust would follow. Every hoofstep kicked up clouds. Fine, chalky grit that clung to sweat-drenched skin, settled into beards and coated tongues. By midday, a man's mouth would be lined with the taste of earth. His lips would crack and bleed if he smiled. Talking became painful. Breathing, a dry wheeze. The cattle suffered too. Their cries became hoarse, their movements sluggish. They crowded around the smallest trickle of moisture, often trampling each other in their desperation. More than once, a cowboy was thrown or crushed during these moments of chaos, caught between beasts, driven mad by thirst. And yet, the cowboy could not afford to drink freely. Rationing became ritual, a sip at dawn, another at noon. Perhaps two if the heat was unbearable. Some tried to cheat the rules, hiding extra flasks, bribing water boys. But the land punished greed. Overdrinking meant less for others, less for the horses, less for the drive, and a cowboy without discipline did not last long. The horses, too, were rationed. They were given what little could be spared. A dehydrated horse stumbled. A stumbling horse could fall. And a cowboy on foot, with no mount between him and the next spring, might never be seen again. Rain was rare. When it came, it often fell, all at once, angry, reckless storms that washed over the trail, carving trenches and turning dust to sticky clay. Cowboys would strip off their hats and tilt them skyward, catching whatever they could. Some lay flat on their backs, mouths open, to the downpour, laughing like madmen. But rain was a gift that often came too late, or not at all. In dry seasons, water could be miles apart. Springs once reliable might vanish. Wells could be poisoned by decay, by sabotage, or simply by time. The land changed. What was once salvation might now be death. And so they rode, eyes scanning for the shimmer of water, noses attuned to the scent of moisture in the wind. There were tricks, some taught by native guides, others passed between cowboys. Following animal tracks might lead to water. Digging beneath willows could yield muddy seepage. Some chewed cactus pulp, despite its bitterness. Others sucked on small pebbles, just to fool the mouth into producing saliva. But tricks only went so far. In the end, a man needed water, or he would die. Dehydration came slowly at first. Dizziness, a pounding headache, skin that no longer sweated. Then came nausea, muscle cramps, a racing heart. A cowboy might begin to speak nonsense. He might see water where there was none, mirages dancing at the edge of his vision. Some men wandered off in search of phantom springs. Others collapsed beside their horses, never to rise again. And yet there were no headlines for their passing, no markers. Just another body given back to the dust. In the worst moments, cowboys turned to desperate measures. Drinking from puddles, shared with cattle, thick with manure. Sipping water from boot prints. Boiling water filled with parasites, hoping heat would save them. Many got sick. Diarrhea. Fever. Stomach cramps so severe they curled into the ground and prayed for darkness. clean. Water, when it was found, became holy. A cold spring bubbling from rock. A shaded stream still untouched by herd. Cowboys would dip their faces into the current, drink deeply, feel life return in trembling gulps. They would wash their hands, their faces, sometimes their entire bodies, though rarely all at once, for time was short and the trail always called. In those moments, they laughed again, smiled again. Their voices came back. The world regained its color, but even in celebration, they knew it would not last. The next leg of the trail might be drier, the next spring might have gone still. And so, they filled their canteens, wet, their lips, and rode on. To thirst, then, was not a passing discomfort. It was a way of life. A low, constant ache beneath every thought. It made men hard. It made them quiet. It stripped away sentiment, leaving only will. And yet, they bore it. Because the cattle must reach market, because the paycheck waited at the end of the line, because turning back meant starvation of another kind, and because, in the brutal arithmetic of cowboy life, a dry mouth was better than no mouth at all. So when next you sip from a faucet, or pour a glass without a second thought, remember the men who rode with dust in their lungs and sand on their tongues, who prayed not for wealth nor glory, but for one more sip of something cool and clean and kind. The crackling glow of a campfire beneath a bowl of stars has long been a beloved image, warm, peaceful, almost poetic. Hollywood and old novels would have us believe that cowboys gathered nightly around flickering flames, bellies full, songs in their throats, beans bubbling cheerfully in well-worn pots. But for the cowboys who lived the life and walked the miles, supper was no celebration. It was survival. And more often than not, it was disappointment scraped from the bottom of a tin. Food, like water, was always in short supply. A cattle drive could last weeks or even months, and there was no promise of nearby towns or stocked outposts. Every meal had to be carried in, cooked on the trail, and stretched as thin as the patience of the men who relied on it. Chuck wagons followed the herds, helmed by cookies. Trail cooks whose skill varied wildly. Some were former ranchers too injured to ride. Others were drifters who'd failed at everything else. Few were trained chefs, and even fewer had anything good to cook with. The staple of the trail was beans, dried pinto or navy beans, soaked and simmered for hours if water allowed, or half-cooked if it didn't. They filled the stomach and provided some measure of protein, but after the third or fourth day, the taste became punishment. Without proper soaking, the beans stayed tough, rattling in the tin like stones. Worse still, they often fermented in the pot beneath the sun, souring before the second helping. Next came salted meat, most often bacon or salt pork, preserved into near indestructibility. It was sliced thin, fried until leathery, and eaten without ceremony. The salt content was so high that some cowboys claimed it drew water from their mouths before they even swallowed. On days when no fire could be made, they chewed it raw, tearing it with worn molars, grimacing through each bite. When supplies ran low, flour became the fallback. Mixed with water and fried into hard cakes, it became hardtack or trail bread, a tasteless, brittle substance that broke teeth and tested morale. Cowboys often joked that if dropped from a height, it could kill a man. Still, they ate it. Hunger, like dust, made everything unavoidable. Coffee was a rare luxury. When it was available, it came in grounds so rough they might as well have been pebbles. Boiled in blackened pots and strained through shirts or bandanas, it offered warmth and a flicker of comfort. But only if there was water, only if there was time, and only if the cook hadn't burned it, which happened more often than not. Sometimes there was dried fruit, apples or prunes, brought along in bags tied tight. Rehydrated over fire, they gave a sweetness that cowboys craved. But they were expensive and quick to spoil. More often, they were rationed to the point of absence. Fresh meat, ironically, was rare. Despite being surrounded by cattle, The cowboys could not simply take one for their supper. Each head was property headed for market. Killing one meant a deduction from the profit, and in some outfits, a beating or dismissal. Only if a cow broke a leg or died of illness would it be used. Even then, the meat had to be cleaned quickly, without refrigeration, and often cooked, beyond recognition, just to make it safe. Wild game offered some relief: jackrabbits, prairie chickens, even the occasional deer, but hunting required time and ammunition, both of which were in short supply. A missed shot meant nothing gained, and danger risked. And if the shot rang out too near the herd, it could cause a stampede. Most cooks discouraged it. Some forbade it entirely. There were stories, passed quietly between riders, of men eating snakes or lizards, not out of choice, but out of sheer desperation. A few knew how to catch and clean them, most didn't. It was a last resort, done in shame, the act of a man pushed beyond his limits. By the end of a long day's ride, 12, sometimes 16 hours in the saddle, what awaited at supper was rarely enough. Hunger was constant, gnawing at the edges of every thought. Men went to sleep with empty stomachs more often than not. Some hoarded bits of bread or salted meat, hidden in saddlebags. Others traded stories of meals past, roasts and pies from home, long gone now, remembered only as ghosts in the night. Around the fire, there was little laughter, no gleaming plates, no cheerful toasts, just the clink of spoons in dented tins, the crunch of grit between molars, and the silence of men chewing because there was nothing else to say. Food was not nourishment, it was fuel. And even that, sometimes, it failed to be. As weeks passed, bodies thinned, belts were tightened another notch, eyes grew sunken, energy waned, cuts healed slower, tempers flared more easily, malnutrition settled in like a silent fog, dulling thought and dragging feet. A cowboy could not afford to grow weak, but he had no power to stop it. The worst nights were when no fire could be lit, when the wind howled too hard or the rain soaked the kindling. Then the men went without. They lay in their blankets, stomachs hollow, jaws aching from clenched hunger. Some whispered prayers, others cursed the land. Most just stared into the dark, dreaming of kitchens they'd never see again. And yet, they woke and rode the next day, because hunger was not unique to the trail. It followed them from town to town, from job to job. It was a way of life. The supper from a tin, the burnt biscuit, the dry bean, these were not hardships. They were constants, predictable, if nothing else. So let us not picture the cowboys' meal as a rustic delight, shared with friends beneath a starlit sky. Let us remember the rusted spoons, the bitter coffee, the gnawing ache in the gut, and let us give quiet thanks for our full tables, our warm stoves, and the generations of silent men who knew what it was to go without. The idea of sleeping under the stars has long captivated poets and wanderers alike. To lie on open earth, cradled by the night, with constellations wheeling overhead and coyotes howling in the distance, such images carry a romance that lingers even now. But for the cowboy, there was no poetry in the night, no hush of peace, no gentle slumber. Sleep was not rest. It was interruption, always incomplete, always uncertain. After the long hours of riding, back aching, mouth dry, legs stiffened from the saddle, most cowboys craved rest more than anything else. But rest did not come easily. There were duties even after sundown. Horses needed hobbling or staking. Gear had to be checked. The fire, if one could be built, had to be tended. And there was always the night watch, assigned in shifts, 2 or 3 hours at a time, where a man stood guard over the herd, eyes sharp for wolves, rustlers, or the creeping fear of a stampede. And when at last a cowboy unrolled his bedroll, it was often in haste and without ceremony. There were no tents, no soft mattresses, just canvas and wool laid over the hard ground, often damp with dew or frozen from the wind. The bedroll, if a man was lucky, consisted of a single worn blanket, perhaps a second for layering, and a saddle for a pillow. Some cowboys stuffed spare clothes beneath their heads or used their boots if no other option presented itself. The ground was never truly comfortable. Stones jabbed the ribs, roots bruised hips, ants found their way beneath the canvas. In the wet seasons, everything turned to mud. In the dry, dust crept into nostrils and ears, coating the mouth in grit before dreams could even take hold. A cowboy might shift dozens of times before drifting off, and even then, sleep came shallow, guarded, fleeting. The wind was a constant presence. It moaned across the plains, tugging at blankets, prying into collars, whistling lullabies of sorrow. Some men wrapped themselves like mummies, cocooned against the chill. Others lay half exposed, too tired to care, too broken to resist. Many nights, the temperature dropped so swiftly that breath steamed in the moonlight. Fingers numbed, teeth chattered, blankets turned stiff with frost. Bugs were another nightly torment. Mosquitoes in summer, ticks in the brush, lice carried in clothing and hair, bred without mercy. There were no sprays, no salves, no easy cures. A man itched and bled and endured. He might wake with welts across his face, or a swollen lip from a spider's bite. The insects, like the dust and the cold, did not sleep. And then there were the sounds, the low murmurs of cattle, the shifting of hooves, the sudden snort of a startled horse. Coyotes yelped in the distance. Owls called. Sometimes a distant gunshot echoed through the night, sending men to their feet, hands reaching instinctively for pistols. Most nights passed without incident, but that never stopped the mind from fearing what might come. Stampedes were every cowboy's nightmare. One spark, a clap of thunder, a twig snapping beneath a stray boot, and thousands of pounds of flesh could surge into motion. A stampede at night was a maelstrom of sound and terror. Hooves pounding, dust flying, men shouting in vain. There was no time to think, only to react. Cowboys might leap from bedrolls half-dressed, scrambling for horses, trying to steer the herd back into calm. Injuries were common, deaths not rare. Because of this, sleep was never deep. A man remained half aware, even in slumber. His ears twitched at every rustle. His hand rested close to his hatchet or revolver. He learned to doze like prey, lightly, nervously, with one eye always half open. On clear nights, the stars offered a kind of cold company. They were immense, unblinking, indifferent. Some cowboys took comfort in their patterns, the Big Dipper pointing north, Orion rising late in the season. Others felt only loneliness, staring up at distant fires that would never warm them. Dreams came slowly, and when they did, they were rarely kind. Dreams of home often, of porches and supper tables, of warm beds and softer voices, a mother's lullaby, a father's steady stride, a girl's laugh beneath willow branches. These memories were both balm and wound. They reminded the cowboy of what he'd lost, or what had never truly been his. When morning finally came, it was no relief. The sun rose without kindness. The cold remained for another hour or two before giving way to dust and heat. Men stretched and winced. Backs cracked. Ankles rolled with the stiffness of old injuries. The fire was stirred, if embers remained. Coffee, if there was any, was brewed. And then the day began anew, as if the night had never been. There were no weekends, no sick days, no sleeping in. A cowboy's body aged faster than his years. Sleep deprivation carved deep lines into his face, hollowed his cheeks, grayed his hair. And yet, it was expected, unquestioned. Just another cost of the life he'd chosen, or the life that had chosen him. The mythology of the cowboy often forgets the weight of these nights. It forgets the sleepless hours beneath freezing stars, the insect bites that festered, the bone-deep fatigue that no rest could cure. It forgets that for every ride into the sunset, there was a night spent wondering if dawn would ever come. So, let us not romanticize the stars too quickly. let us remember the men who lay beneath them not in leisure, but in exhaustion, who pulled blankets tight not for charm, but for survival, who dreamed not of adventure, but of sleep, deep, quiet, uninterrupted, and who rarely found it. To the outsider, the cowboy's bond with cattle might seem straightforward, a man and his herd moving as one across the open plain. Films depict it as almost poetic, the cowboy whistling from his saddle while the herd ambles obediently across golden grass. But for the men who lived it, herding cattle was not an elegant dance. It was a daily war against chaos, fought with curses, sweat, and a weariness that sank to the very marrow. Cattle, scruffy, wild, stubborn things, had no loyalty. They did not follow because they trusted. They followed because they were pushed, prodded, and cornered. And even then, they resisted. Every day they scattered, panicked, refused to move, or stampeded in blind terror. The cowboy was less a shepherd than a reluctant jailer, forever chasing beasts that wanted nothing more than to escape. A typical herd might number 2,000 to 3,000 head. No fences, no gates, just the sky above and the earth below, and a few dozen cowboys trying to keep them together. The animals themselves came from different ranches, born to different climates, and were often mixed with minimal sorting. Some were barely broken to human presence. Others were old and slow, liable to drop dead from a hard push. And all of them, every single one, had a mind of its own. Driving a herd meant constant motion. From sunup to sundown, cowboys circled, like satellites, riding at the flanks, the rear, and the point. Each position had its own name: point men, flankers, drag riders. The drag, perhaps the most dreaded role, placed the cowboy behind the herd, breathing dust, coughing through manure-flecked air, eyes watering from grit and stench. "Here!" he shouted, waved, cracked whips, and drove forward the stragglers, the weak and the unwilling. Cattle moved slowly. A full day might yield 10 to 15 miles, sometimes less. And even that small progress was hard won. A single animal, turning off the trail, could start a ripple effect. Others would follow, and soon 100 steers might be ploughing into thorny brush, down ravines, or into treacherous streams. The cowboys would yell, whistle, or fire pistols into the air, riding hard to cut them off, their horses stumbling over stones and roots, their legs gripped in tight panic. Calves made the work worse. Easily spooked, they darted beneath larger animals, bawling for their mothers, triggering panics that spread like wildfire. If a calf was separated and refused to move, a cowboy might have to dismount, hoist the squirming, terrified creature across his saddle, and walk the rest of the day, his legs aching, his horse burdened, his patience fraying thin. Night offered no relief. The herd did not sleep peacefully. Cattle are prey animals, nervous, alert, easily disturbed. A sudden noise, a distant coyote's howl, a flicker of lightning on the horizon. Any of these could turn them into a frenzied mob, the dreaded stampede. There are few sounds more terrifying than the first thunder of hooves in the dark. A low rumble, like distant drums. Then it grows, fast, overwhelming. Thousands of pounds of muscle charging blindly into the night. Dust clouds rise, the ground quakes. Cowboys leap from sleep, scrambling onto horses, racing to turn the herd into a circle, to slow it, contain it, survive it. Men have died beneath those hooves, crushed while trying to save the cattle, or trampled in confusion. Others lost horses, broken bones, or simply vanished in the chaos, never found again. Even in calm, the herd was never still. Flies bit relentlessly. Heat caused bloating. Cattle wandered, chewed strange plants, drank poisoned water. One sick animal could infect dozens. A bloated carcass could taint a stream. Cowboys had to inspect them constantly, watch for limps, for coughing, for the slack-eyed look of death creeping near. They jabbed with sticks, tugged on ropes, sang to calm. Them, cursed when they kicked. Branding season brought its own horrors. Calves were wrestled to the ground, crying in fear, while red-hot irons seared flesh. The smell of burning hair and scorched hide clung to everything. The calves screamed, mothers bawled, cowboys sweated and cursed, arms trembling from restraint. It was brutal. It was necessary. And it was unending. Some cowboys developed a kind of grim affection for their charges. They gave names to the quirkiest ones. One Eye, Lameback, Old Mud Nose. They joked about personalities, claimed certain cows were smarter or meaner than others. But sentiment had no real place. If a steer died, it meant lost profit. If one wandered off, it had to be recovered or deducted from the cowboy's pay. Emotion was a luxury. The cattle were numbers, meat, weight to be moved from pasture to profit. And yet, despite all their frustration, cowboys could never let their guard down. A cow could gore with its horns. A bull could charge. Even a calf panicked could break. A man's foot with one misstep. Every day was risk. Every movement a calculation. The truth was, cowboys spent more time with cattle than with any human soul. They knew the grunts, the huffs, the posture of distress. They spoke in tones that soothed or spurred. They learned to read the language of beasts who gave nothing back but drool and noise. And in the quietest hours, when the stars were high, the herd murmured softly, and the wind passed without complaint, a cowboy might listen to that low, constant sound, the deep rhythmic breathing of 1,000 lives that depended on his strength. And in that moment, he might feel both burdened and needed, connected in some strange, unspoken way to the very creatures that had stolen his sleep and trampled his peace. Because in the end, the herd defined the cowboy's life. Not the hat, not the gun, not the spurs or saddle, but the long, grueling, heartbreaking journey with beasts that neither loved him nor thanked him, only moved when pushed, and cried when broken. The cowboy's world was one of motion, always riding, always shifting with the rhythm of hooves and the demands of cattle. But motion came at a price. Beneath the poetry of spurred heels and windswept gallops was a slow and brutal toll on the body paid daily in aches, strains, and the quiet suffering of men too proud or too poor to stop. Each morning began with stiffness. A cowboy would roll from his bedroll with the groan of old wood, joints popping, muscles tight, back already sore before the first mount. The saddle awaited, cracked and creaking, its leather hard from sweat and sun. There were no cushions, no adjustments, no luxuries. A saddle fit one way, and the cowboy fit himself to it, or he didn't ride at all, and ride he must. Hours in the saddle, 12, sometimes 14, without pause, wore on a man like slow erosion. The spine bore the brunt, with every jolt and jostle, each shift in terrain, the vertebrae compressed. There were no chiropractors, no painkillers beyond whiskey and grit. The result was a permanent stoop in the shoulders, a crooked neck, and a gait that dragged more than it strode. Hips ached from the wide stance forced by the saddle's curve. Knees stiffened from gripping too long. Ankles swelled, feet cramped. Blisters rubbed raw where boots pressed against stirrups, even after years of hardening. And still, the cowboy rode. He learned to live in pain, to mount with a grunt, to swing down with a wince, to walk only when forced, for walking brought its own agony. Legs too long in the saddle moved like rusted hinges. Sitting again was no better. Bones ground against each other, joints throbbed, and muscles trembled from overuse. Shoulders bore the weight of gear, bedrolls, rifles, rope, canteens, all strapped and tied, chafing the skin through dusty shirts. Hands cracked and swelled, fingers curled from the constant grip on reins and rope, joints knotted like tree roots. Some men lost full motion in their hands before 30. Others kept riding with splints made from wood or metal, just to keep their fingers straight. Tiatikai, repetition was relentless. Mount, ride, dismount, bend to tie a rope, lift a calf, swing a branding iron, unsaddle the horse, carry feed, bend again, stretch, lift, pull. All beneath a sun that sapped energy, in winds that dried the sweat before it could cool, in cold that stiffened the bones and numbed the fingertips. Injuries were inevitable. A thrown horse meant cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, or worse. Lifting a struggling steer could tear a muscle or rupture a tendon. There were no hospitals nearby, only crude splints, bandages made from torn shirts, and the bitter taste of biting leather while the bone was set. Rest was rare and never sufficient. Sleep came in short stretches, interrupted by herd duties or cold. A man might lie down exhausted and wake more tired than before. There was no recovery, only continuation. The cumulative toll was devastating. Young men aged early. By 40, many cowboys had backs bent like old trees, knees that no longer supported their weight, and hands that trembled without rest. Some walked with canes, others dragged one leg behind them. Their bodies had been offered up to the trail, and the trail had taken everything. And yet, pride kept them going. Pain was not discussed. To complain was to admit weakness, and weakness had no place on the range. If a man grunted while swinging into the saddle, the others pretended not to hear. If he limped, they walked slower to match, but they did not speak of it. Pain was a shared secret, unacknowledged and ever present. Sometimes, the only relief came in stillness. Those rare moments when the herd was calm, the sun low, and the horse moved at a walk. The cowboy might loosen the reins, let his shoulders relax, feel the wind cool against his face. In those minutes, he remembered what it was like to breathe without flinching. But the moment never lasted, because cattle did not wait. The sun did. Not wait, the job was never done. Some tried to find tricks, padding their saddles with wool or hides, wearing extra layers beneath their shirts, cutting slits in their boots to ease pressure. But nothing stopped the march of damage. It could only be slowed, and the longer they rode, the more the pain became a part of them. Many men ended their days not on horseback, but in boarding houses, hobbling down wooden steps, gripping rails with white-knuckled fingers, their bodies warped by years of toil. They told stories to wide-eyed boys, tales of broncos and bandits, but they did not speak of the mornings they could not rise, or the nights they lay awake, bones pulsing in the dark, because to be a cowboy was to accept pain as the cost of freedom. And though the cost was steep, they paid it in silence, day after day. So when next you see the image of a cowboy atop his horse, back straight, hat proud, remember the truth beneath the image. Remember the aching spine, the swollen joints, the quiet grimace beneath the beard. Remember that every mile was carved into his flesh, and that behind the romance of the ride was a body held together by nothing more than will. The cowboy is often imagined with a gun upon his hip, its silver glint a badge of power and certainty. The revolver, in stories and songs, is a symbol of courage, of justice rendered in an instant, of a man who stands alone yet unafraid. But for the real cowboy, dust-streaked, sleep-starved, and always outnumbered by the hazards of the trail, the gun was not a tool of glory. It was a reminder of how thin the line was between life and silence. Most cowboys did carry firearms. Pistols were common, though often outdated, purchased second-hand or inherited from another man's death. Rifles were prized for their accuracy and range, especially when riding through hostile land. Ammunition was precious and rarely wasted. There were no casual shots, no target practice for fun. Every bullet was accounted for, and each shot meant risk. Guns were heavy. They pulled at the hips, chafed against leather belts, and bruised ribs during long rides. Cleaning them was an act of devotion, done in low light, often by fire, with the smell of oil and soot mixing into the night air. A jammed weapon was worse than no weapon at all, and many a man met his end fumbling with a rusty cylinder. But the real danger was not in drawing the gun, it was in deciding when not to. The Wild West was less a battlefield and more a simmering pot of tensions. Cowboys were not lawmen. They had no authority, no badge, no backup, yet they moved through territories riddled with threat. Outlaws on the run, desperate homesteaders, rival outfits, drunken gamblers, and the ever-changing line between friend and foe. Towns were few, and laws fewer still. The sheriff, if he existed, was often as overworked and underpaid as the men he was supposed to protect. A saloon brawl could become a killing in a heartbeat. A crooked card game could end with a body slumped across the table, and when tempers flared among cowboys themselves, over a stolen blanket, a misplaced saddle, or a woman seen in the wrong light, violence erupted swiftly and without ceremony. Many cowboys feared not the outlaw in black, but their own trail partners. After weeks of hunger, thirst, and sleep deprivation, men became brittle. Words turned sharp. Knives appeared quicker than apologies. There were no trials, no courts on the trail, only a decision made in heat, and a life ended because of it. And then there were those who hunted cowboys for profit. Rustlers followed herds from a distance, waiting for the right moment to strike. A poorly guarded flank, a distracted watch. They would drive off cattle by night, sometimes shoot riders to cover their tracks. Indian raiding parties, especially in the earlier decades of westward expansion, also posed a threat, defending their lands against what they rightly saw as invasion. Not all were hostile. Some offered warning. Others did not. To ride the range was to be constantly exposed. The landscape offered no cover. A lone figure could be seen from miles away, silhouetted, against sky and sage. Gunfire echoed across the plains, cold and unanswerable. A single shot might mean nothing, or it might mean a friend was bleeding out somewhere just over the ridge. Wounds were rarely clean. The guns of the time were powerful but imprecise. A bullet to the gut meant a slow death, hours or days of agony. A shot to the limb could cripple. There was little chance for medical care. No antiseptics, no morphine, unless you had connections or luck. Whiskey dulled the pain, but not the infection. Men died from small wounds, not because they were mortal, but because no help would come. And what of the man who fired? He lived with the weight. Killing, even in defense, was not without consequence. Some men hardened. They wore it like a scar, quiet and hidden. Others broke, haunted by the sound of the shot, the way a man fell, the look in his eyes. These things were rarely spoken of. There was no language for remorse among cowboys, only the hollow silence left behind. There were rituals, of respect too when death came, a shallow grave dug hastily, a hat removed, perhaps a name spoken aloud if it was known, maybe a cross carved into a rock, or initials scratched into a nearby tree. But often there was no time, no tools, no marker. Just a man returned to the dust, his story ending in a whisper of wind and gunpowder, and still the cowboys rode armed. Because without a weapon, a man was meat for wolves, whether they had fur or human skin. They learned to live with that vulnerability, to feel eyes on, their backs even when none were there, to walk into towns with their hands near their belts, heads low, to listen to footsteps in the night, to recognize when a silence became too silent. Violence was not a thrill. It was a presence, like the sun, like thirst. It could be summoned in a moment, but never fully dismissed. It lingered in the glint of a blade, the cock of a hammer, the tension in a man's shoulders. And the worst part was, the cowboy never truly knew if he would be victim or survivor. He carried both possibilities in his saddlebag, one beside the other. So the next time you hear the distant crack of a gun in some dusty tale, imagine not the heroic draw or the clean shot, but the silence that follows, the broken breath, the dirt clinging to blood, the questions that will never be answered. Because in the West, a gun did not protect, it did not redeem. It simply delayed fate or hastened it. In portraits and legends, the cowboy often appears as a figure larger than life, a man of principle, stoicism, and singular resolve. His hat pulled low, his silhouette noble against the skyline. He strides through towns like an icon, but behind that wide brim and beneath the dust-smeared face was often something far less defined. For in truth, many cowboys were strangers, not only to the towns they passed through, but to themselves. The life of a cowboy was one of constant motion. Few stayed rooted to any one place. The cattle drives pulled them across states, over rivers, through canyons and plains, always toward a distant railhead or market town. The names of the places blurred: Abilene, Dodge City, Cheyenne, Laramie, each with its own saloon, its own dangers, its own moment of false comfort. But rarely did a cowboy linger, and so identities thinned. Most cowboys were known by nicknames: Slim, Dusty, Red, Tex. Rarely their given names. Some used false ones from the start, borrowed from a dead man or invented on the trail. Others abandoned their pasts on purpose. Runaways, ex-soldiers, orphaned boys turned men too fast. Immigrants who'd left their birth tongue behind. Freedmen riding with white hands and black scars. Even outlaws seeking a life less hunted. The result was a world where few asked questions. A cowboy might ride beside another for weeks, sharing meals, stories, even dangers, and still not know where the man came from or if he had family. Some preferred it that way. The past was heavy, easier to live as a ghost. Towns, too, treated cowboys as passing shadows. They arrived with dust on their coats, spent what little they had on whiskey and cards, then vanished with the morning light. To many townsfolk, they were drifters, dirty, loud, a source of both commerce and concern. Fights followed them, so did theft. And though some cowboys were kind and generous, the badge of the profession carried suspicion. There were no records, no photographs, no guarantees. A man could die on the trail and leave behind no trace, no letter, no family name, no inheritance. Only the memory of his voice among a few others, fading quickly with the miles. This anonymity had its freedoms. A man could reinvent himself with every town. He could be a war hero one day, a rancher the next. Lies flowed like whiskey, and no one had cause to challenge them. There was a strange power in being unknown, a kind of protection. But that same freedom came at a cost. Without roots, a man had little to tether him to kindness. Without a name, it was easy to forget that he mattered. Loneliness took deeper hold when no one remembered your birthday, your childhood, your real face. When you died, your story ended. Not with mourning, but with indifference. And identity was not only lost outwardly, it decayed within. Long months on the trail stripped away more than physical comfort. They eroded belief. A man began to forget who he had been. He wore 1,000 faces for 1,000 strangers, and slowly, his own reflection became unfamiliar. Some cowboys tried to preserve themselves through small rituals. A letter kept folded in a pocket, unread but held close. A locket. A photograph, blurred and weathered. A Bible with a name scrawled in a child's hand. These tokens were not vanity. They were anchors, proof that somewhere, someone had once known them, loved them, called them by something real. Others gave up entirely. They drank to silence the gaps in their memory. They gambled not for money, but for distraction. In brothels, they sought not only pleasure, but identity. A brief moment where someone spoke their name, even if it was a lie. The anonymity bred danger too. With no past to verify, men could vanish after crimes. Cowboys were often blamed for things they did not do. A fight in one town could follow them to the next, rumors moving faster than hoofbeats. Many men were hanged for names that were not their own. Trust was fragile, friendship hard-won and easily lost. Loyalty existed, but it was conditional, built on survival more than sentiment. The unspoken rule was, do your job, watch your partners, back, don't ask too much, and keep riding. But every now and then, the mask would slip. A cowboy, in the quiet moment between dusk and supper, might speak of a sister back east, of a farm long lost to debt, of a mother's voice he couldn't quite recall. These confessions came in murmurs, eyes fixed on the fire, hands still moving over worn gear. They passed quickly and were rarely repeated. There were stories of cowboys who gave it up, who found a woman, bought a plot, planted roots. They changed their clothes, their trade, their ways. But even then, some said the trail called them back, that the stillness was worse than the road, that they missed the freedom more than they loved the name carved on their gate. So the hat stayed low. The eyes watched but did not linger, and the cowboy rode on, a stranger in every land, a mystery in every town. He bore no legacy, no monument, only footprints that the wind would erase. And in that quiet disappearance, there was something both tragic and noble. A man untethered, uncelebrated, but still moving forward. Because sometimes it was better not to be known, better to carry your story in silence and to let the world remember you not as a name, but as a shape against the setting sun. It is often imagined that cowboys were masters of their own fate, men who lived on their own terms, whose grit and labour were fairly rewarded by the wide, generous land they served. But behind the myth of the free-roaming rider lay a more sobering truth. The cowboy was rarely his own man. He was, more often than not, the hired hand of a faceless owner, working long, back-breaking hours for meagre pay, under the watchful eye of men who never lifted a hand but owned everything he touched. Boss never rides, they used to say, and it was true. The owners, wealthy cattle barons, absentee investors, or retired soldiers turned land magnates, rarely set foot on the trail. Their boots were polished, their hands soft, their decisions made from shaded porches or distant offices. They employed foremen to handle the day-to-day, who in turn ruled over crews of cowboys with stern gazes and calloused authority. The chain of command was firm, and at the bottom of that chain stood the working cowboy, expendable, replaceable, and expected to endure. The pay was insultingly low. A typical cowboy in the late 1800s earned between $25 to $40 a month. That figure sounds quaint now, but even then, it was barely enough to scrape by. After buying supplies, gloves, coffee, tobacco, gun oil, little remained. Many cowboys sent money home or kept it hidden in bedrolls, fearing theft in lawless towns. Some gambled their earnings away in saloons, not out of recklessness, but out of the quiet despair that came with knowing they'd never have enough to build anything lasting. There were no contracts, no guarantees. Work was seasonal and sporadic. One drive might last 3 months, the next, nothing. Ranches laid men off without warning. Injuries ended careers with no compensation. If a man fell from a horse or caught a branding iron across the hand, he was often left behind, patched up if lucky, forgotten if not. Lodging was worse than Spartan. On the trail, cowboys slept beneath the stars or in crude tents. At ranches, they were herded into bunkhouses, narrow, drafty buildings with straw mattresses, vermin in the corners, and the stench of unwashed bodies hanging heavy in the air. There was no privacy, no peace, just rows of snoring, coughing, groaning men, each one trapped in the same grind of exhaustion and obligation. Food, as we have seen, was barely edible. Rations were stretched thin. Trail cooks were often bitter, overworked, and untrained. Meals were repetitive, and those who complained were swiftly reminded of their replaceability. Clean water was rationed, and alcohol flowed freely, used more, for forgetting than for celebration. The cowboys who lasted longest were those who asked the fewest questions. Obedience was rewarded with continued work. Dissent led to exile. A man who questioned the route, the pay, or the treatment of his fellows might find himself fired on the spot. Or worse, blacklisted. His name passed between ranches as one not to be trusted. Some foremen took advantage of this power. They played favorites, withheld pay, assigned dangerous tasks to men they disliked. Others were fair, but bound by the same system. Even the best foreman could not raise a man's wage or guarantee his safety. There was no protection for cowboys, no unions, no labor laws, no insurance. Injuries were common, and deaths more so than records suggest. A man could drown in a river crossing, be crushed by a spooked steer, or shot in a midnight raid. His belongings would be packed, his name marked in a ledger, and his bunk given to the next desperate soul. Women rarely rode the trail, but they worked on the fringes of this harsh economy. Some ran boarding houses or cooked in frontier towns. Others worked in saloons, selling smiles for coins. Their lives were no easier, and their exploitation just as deep. Marriage, for many cowboys, was a distant dream. Most would never earn enough to support a household. Some started families and left them behind, swallowed by the demands of work that offered no home. Cowboys came from everywhere. Poor whites from the South, black freedmen seeking wages, Mexican vaqueros with deep knowledge of the land. Yet racism and prejudice colored their treatment. Black and brown riders often earned less, were given worse horses, and had the hardest jobs. Their stories have been largely erased from the mainstream myth, though they rode the same miles, bore the same burdens, and bled the same on the trail. Even their gear was often company issued, saddles borrowed, ropes shared, boots patched from another man's cast-offs. There was no room for pride, only function. The cowboy's silhouette may have inspired admiration, but his reality was grim. His labor enriched others. His strength built the cattle empires, yet he walked away with little, if anything, to show. The boss never rode, but he profited from every mile. And still, the cowboy endured. Because what choice did he have? Factory work in eastern cities was worse. Farming meant owning land, which required money and luck. The trail, for all its pain, offered a kind of dignity. The cowboy could still ride, still breathe free air, still feel, however fleetingly, that the horizon belonged to him, even if his paycheck did not. So let us not picture the cowboy as a wealthy rancher, surveying his land from atop a pristine horse. Let us remember the thin wallet, the sore hands, the debts unpaid. Let us recall the men who worked from dawn to darkness, under orders shouted from porches, knowing their labor would line another man's pocket. And let us speak with quiet respect of those who bore it anyway, not because they were content, but because there was nowhere else to go. The cowboy lived close to the earth, not metaphorically, but physically, intimately. His hands dug into soil, his feet trod upon rock and thorn. His body lay against the ground each night, exposed to everything that stirred in the tall grass. And while stories of the West often dwell on bandits and duels, the cowboy's most persistent dangers came not from men, but from nature itself, silent and patient and ever watchful. Nowhere was this more evident than in his relationship with the creatures that shared the land. Rattlesnakes, scorpions, mountain lions, wolves, ticks, and mosquitoes were more than nuisances. They were daily companions, unpredictable, deadly, and unbothered by cowboy myths. The rattlesnake, in particular, was a feared constant. It did not strike out of malice, but out of proximity. Tall boots offered some protection, but many cowboys were bitten while reaching into saddlebags, lifting rocks to make camp, or simply stepping through dry brush. A bite was not always fatal, but it was always devastating. The venom caused swelling, intense pain, and blackened flesh. Without proper treatment, which was nearly always unavailable, a man might lose a limb or linger in agony for days. Anti-venom did not exist on the trail. Remedies were folk-based and inconsistent. Some men tried to suck the poison out, a desperate and largely ineffective act. Others packed mud over the wound or made shallow cuts to bleed the venom. But most simply gritted their teeth and hoped. If the bite was high, thigh, or chest, the outlook was grim. Many died with their fists clenched and their eyes fixed on an empty sky. Scorpions crept into boots at night, their stings sharp and burning. Cowboys learned to shake out every article of clothing each morning: boots, gloves, even hats. One careless moment could mean a hand swollen twice its size, fever, or a painful infection. Yet scorpions were not aggressive unless threatened. Like many of the cowboy's adversaries, they simply existed, and he existed beside them, uneasily. Then there were the wolves. Hollywood would later romanticize the cowboy as a solitary figure sharing a moonlit bond with these wild cousins of the dog. But wolves were no allies. They were competitors, drawn to the herd by the scent of blood, death, or weakness. Most nights, the cowboys heard their howls on the wind, rising and falling like mournful songs. Sometimes they would see yellow eyes just beyond the firelight. If a calf lagged behind or a steer fell injured, the wolves would circle. A single wolf could be chased off. A pack, never. Some ranchers issued rifles for these threats. Others did not. The cowboy might carry a gun, but ammunition was scarce. Wolves were fast, clever. They struck when a man slept or when he was too far from help. A cowboy might return from a water run to find a half-devoured carcass, and his pay docked for the loss. Mountain lions, though rarer, posed greater risk. Silent, solitary hunters, they could stalk a man for miles. The cowboy might never hear their approach until it was too late. There were stories, passed in low voices around the campfire, of men dragged screaming from their bedrolls, of horses spooked in the middle of the night, their flesh gashed by claw or fang. Whether all such tales were true mattered little. The fear they sowed was real, and then came the smaller threats, those which didn't roar but killed slowly. Ticks embedded in flesh and passed on fever. Mosquitoes carried malaria in certain swamps and valleys. A single bite could lead to weeks of weakness, chills, and delirium. Lice infested the scalp, burrowing and multiplying, impossible to remove without shaving clean or boiling clothes, neither of which was practical on the trail. The itching was constant, the shame unspoken. Weather, too, was its own kind of beast. The sun-blistered skin, cracked lips, and boiled tempers. Sunscreen was unheard of. A cowboy's face aged in half the time, leathered and darkened. Snow brought other dangers: frostbite on fingers and toes, hypothermia beneath sodden blankets. A sudden cold snap could freeze a man in his bedroll, stiff by dawn. And in between, there was wind, howling, searing, filled with sand and grit that scoured exposed flesh. Even the land itself was unkind. The plains rolled smooth from a distance, but were filled with hazards. Hidden holes broke ankles. Loose rocks spilled horses. Thorny brush clawed at legs and arms, sometimes deep enough to draw blood. Poison ivy, cactus spines, burrs in the socks, each a small misery, but misery nonetheless. Campfires, essential for warmth and cooking, also brought peril. A strong gust could send embers into dry grass, sparking wildfires. Cowboys learned to stamp their fires out fully, to sleep with water nearby. Still, accidents happened. A tipped pot, a flare too, close to a saddlebag. Fire was both friend and foe, and yet, for all this, nature was not cruel in the way man was cruel. The snake did not bite out of hate. The wolf did not stalk from vengeance. The storm did not choose its targets. These were threats, yes, but honest ones. The cowboy, for all his bravado, respected that truth. He knew that the land owed him nothing, that the animals, the wind, the rain, none of it would pause for his weakness or reward his effort. It simply was, and he learned to move carefully within it. He checked his boots. He watched the stars for signs of storm. He walked around brush instead of through it. He left bits of meat to appease prowling coyotes, not out of superstition but caution. He wore his scarf not only for dust, but to muffle the scent of sweat. He knew where to step, when to pause, when to be still, and when something did go wrong, when the snake bit, or the wolf lunged, or the fire spread. He did not curse the sky. He simply bore it, tended his wounds, and carried on. Because on the trail, nature did not forgive, and the cowboy, though flesh and bone, had to live as if he were something harder. The sky in the American West held two faces. In one moment, it was a canvas of breathtaking beauty, vast, serene, eternal. In the next, it was a hammer descending without warning. To live beneath it was to live beneath something that could both bless and betray with the same breath. For the cowboy, the weather was not background. It was a force, a temperamental master that reshaped his every plan, tested his every bone, and offered no quarter when it turned cruel. There were no shelters. On the trail, no barns, no cabins, no walls to soften the blow of a storm. When the skies darkened and the wind rose, the cowboy faced it with what little he had: a threadbare blanket, a tattered slicker, perhaps a lean-to made of branches if time allowed. More often, there was no time. The storms came fast. Summer brought the fiercest tempests. Thunderheads piled high on the horizon, slow and brooding. They moved like mountains, roiling with lightning and thunder so deep it made the ribs tremble. The wind would pick up first, scattering hats, snapping tents, whistling through the grass like a warning. Then came the rain, sheets of it, cold and heavy, drenching riders and horses alike in minutes. Clothes clung to the body like shackles, saddles soaked through. Hands went numb on the reins. Visibility dropped to nothing, and the trail became a river of mud. Horses slipped, wagons bogged down. Campfires died before they could be lit. And through it all, the cowboys rode, because the herd would not stop, could not stop, not even for the sky. Lightning was the cowboy's most feared assassin. It struck without pattern, without mercy. Men were killed where they stood, their hats smoking, their bodies crumpled beside scorched saddles. Horses collapsed mid-gallop. Trees exploded in flame. Some cowboys believed it was bad luck to wear metal spurs during storms. Others simply prayed beneath their breath and rode on. There was no hiding, only distance and hope. Autumn brought winds, sharp, biting, endless. They tore through coats, dried out eyes and chapped lips until they bled. They stirred the dust into cyclones, obscuring the herd and pelting the skin like sandpaper. At night, the wind howled through the camp like a wounded animal, rattling gear, overturning pots, snapping tent poles. Sleep became impossible. Horses panicked. Cattle grew restless. A storm of wind could scatter a herd just as quickly as wolves or fire. Winter, however, held its own brand of brutality. Snow came early in the higher plains and mountains, soft at first, like a blanket, then harder, colder, deeper. Blankets froze stiff overnight. Boots turned to ice molds. Gloves, if a man had them, grew soaked and brittle. Fingers blackened. Ears numbed. Breathing became painful. The air itself sharp as broken glass. Frostbite was a silent thief. A man might not know he'd lost a toe or a fingertip until the color turned. Once lost, there was no regrowing. Some cowboys rode with hands they could no longer feel, toes that never warmed again. Others simply disappeared in the snow, lost during a blizzard, buried by drifts, never found. Herds panicked in winter storms. Driven by instinct, they might stampede toward perceived shelter, into rivers, over cliffs. Cowboys tried to guide, them with lanterns or torches, riding through the white void, shouting above the wind. But often, they could do nothing, only watch, frozen and helpless, as cattle vanished into the storm. There were no weather reports, no forecasts. The cowboy read the sky like scripture, watching clouds, feeling pressure change in his bones, noting the flight of birds. He trusted. His horse's nervous shiver, the sudden silence of insects, the smell of rain before it came. These signs were not superstition, they were survival. Spring offered brief mercy, but also floods. The melting snow swelled rivers beyond their banks. Trails became swamps. Horses drowned trying to cross. Wagons floated away. And with the floods came disease, waterborne illnesses that stole strength and sleep. The wet ground invited mold. Clothes never dried. Saddle sores festered. Feet blistered and split. Even the sun, on days when it shone, was no gentle friend. It burned. It cracked lips, peeled skin, and blurred vision. The cowboy's hat, though protective, could not stop the long-term damage. Skin cancer, though unnamed then, was not uncommon. Riders grew moles, lesions, sunspots. The corners of their eyes permanently wrinkled, their cheeks as hard as bark. And still, there was no retreat. The drive had to continue. The cattle needed moving. The boss expected results. The pay, meager as it was, depended on progress. So the cowboy endured. He wrapped his scarf tighter, leaned into the wind, lashed his coat closed with rope if buttons broke. He kept moving, always moving, because to stop was to freeze. To stop was to lose the herd. To stop was to be left behind. Some men cursed the sky. Others spoke to it like an old, bitter god. Few believed it could be changed. They simply adapted, worked harder, grew harder. But at night, after the storm passed, after the wind died, and the lightning fled, there was sometimes a stillness so pure it made a man cry. The stars came back. The grass glittered with frost or dew. The horses nickered softly, and the cowboy, sore and soaked and shivering, might look up and whisper thanks, not because he felt blessed, but because he had survived. So when you think of cowboys and the open sky, do not picture only sunsets and soft breezes. Remember the hailstones on bare skin, the thunder that deafened, the rain that turned blankets into burdens. Remember the pain of frostbitten fingers, the fear of fire from above, and remember always that the sky was no ceiling. It was a challenge. 1. The cowboy met not with defiance, but with resignation, and a quiet kind of bravery that needed no witness. The American cowboy was often surrounded by motion, by hoofbeats, shouted orders, the shifting mass of cattle, the howling wind. Yet for all that clamour, his was a life defined by loneliness. Not the kind of quiet solitude that poets find beneath trees, but a gnawing ache in the chest, a constant, low-grade hunger for something more than labour, more than dust and firelight, something that would not come. Out on the trail, there were no embraces, no soft voices in the dark, no hands to hold. There was only the company of other men, each one similarly worn, guarded, and carrying his own emptiness. Conversations came in fits and starts, broken by duty or silence. Affection, when it surfaced, was brief and buried in jest. And so, love, romantic, tender, enduring, was a thing cowboys dreamed of, more than touched. Many had left it behind, sweethearts in distant towns, or in some cases, wives and children they'd abandoned or could no longer provide for. Letters were sent now and then, if the cowboy could write or pay another to do so. Some received replies, most did not. Addresses changed. Lovers married others. Life moved on without them, as it always did. The young ones still spoke of love sometimes, when the fire was low and the moon full. They described girls back home, freckled faces, laughter like bells, promises, whispered behind barns. Their eyes glowed when they talked, softening for a moment. But the older hands rarely said a word. Their memories were too heavy or too far gone to bring back. For the majority, romantic companionship was a seasonal mirage, found, if at all, in frontier towns where coin could buy touch. Brothels, dance halls, or saloon corners offered brief illusions, painted women who smiled for the right price, who listened with practiced nods, who sometimes offered real warmth, though it came wrapped in exhaustion. Some cowboys grew attached to these women, mistaking routine kindness for affection. They left behind their wages, promises, even their names. But when the trail called, they rode away. And when they returned, the woman was gone, or belonged to someone else, or had never been theirs to begin with. Love on the range was not forbidden, it was simply unreachable. There were stories of cowboys who settled down, who gave up the ride for a woman, a patch of land, a chance at something still and rooted. These stories were told wistfully, sometimes with hope, sometimes with contempt. Some men envied those who found a partner, others pitied them, believing they'd traded freedom for fences. But even those who longed for love often found themselves too changed, too broken by the trail to hold it. Years of solitude hardened the heart. Suspicion crept in. Sleep became lighter. Touch felt foreign. The cowboy, shaped by endurance and survival, struggled to soften, to open. And those who tried often failed, returning to the road once more, lonelier than before. It wasn't just romantic love that proved elusive. Friendship, too, was fragile. Cowboys rode with others, yes, shared duties, joked, played cards, helped each other survive. But closeness was rare. Men came and went. Drives ended. Accidents happened. Trust required time, and time was the one thing the trail stole most ruthlessly. And so they guarded their hearts. They kept stories short, secrets closer. They called each other by nicknames. Tex, Slim, Dusty, easier to forget, that way. But even in this hardened silence, the ache remained. It came strongest at night, when the fire burned low and the stars turned indifferent. A man would lie on his bedroll, staring upward, and remember someone who once called his name, softly. A mother, a sister, a woman whose face had long blurred. He would feel it then. The absence, the hollow space beside him where warmth might have been. Some tried to fill that space with song. Cowboy ballads, sung into the wind, told of longing, of loss, of dreams far away. These songs were more than entertainment. They were confession, a way to bleed without showing the wound. Others turned to dogs or horses for connection, a loyal mount, a trail dog with bright eyes. These became surrogate, companions. They listened, they stayed, they did not judge. When a man wept, as some did in the darkest hours, it was to these creatures that his tears fell. There were unspoken bonds too, between riders. Partnerships that grew not from speech, but from shared hardship. One man might ride beside another, for months, neither saying much, but each knowing the other's worth by how he handled storms, cattle, hunger. These were not the friendships of novels. They were quiet, rough-edged, forged in need. And when one died, the other buried him with his own hands, no words needed. Some cowboys turned inward, trying to erase the need altogether. They drank, gambled, picked fights. Others painted fantasies in their minds, stories where they found love after one last drive, where someone waited at the end of the road. But they knew, deep down, that the road did not end, that no one waited. And so, loneliness became not a condition, but a part of the man. It rode with him, slept beside him, woke with him in the chill dawn. It whispered in his ear when the camp grew quiet. It watched as he stared into firelight, not really seeing. It filled the spaces where joy might have bloomed and taught him to live without it. So when we imagine the cowboy as a free soul, untethered, wild, immune to sorrow, we must also imagine the truth. A man alone in a crowd of cattle, dreaming of hands he could not hold, aching in places no salve could reach, because for all his strength, the cowboy was still human. And even the hardest hands craved something soft. As dusk faded into the inky velvet of frontier night, and the last coals of the cook fire were gently buried beneath soft soil, there arose in the distance a different kind of light. Faint at first, flickering, uncertain, then brighter, warmer, golden. It came not from the heavens, but from windows curtained in velvet, from gas lamps flickering behind stained glass. The saloon beckoned like a lighthouse to the weary seafarer, a place where the cowboy might, if only for a night, forget the burdens that clung to his boots and bones, They came to it limping, dusty, hollow-eyed from weeks on the trail. The saloon offered what the plains could not: sound, color, bodies pressed together in warmth and movement. There was music, a piano thumping out ragtime rhythms from warped keys, played by a man who drank as steadily as he played. There were voices, laughter, clinking glasses, the crackle of gambling chips, the rustle of silk against wood, all of it wrapped around the cowboy like a blanket of illusion. Inside, the air was thick, not just with tobacco smoke and whiskey fumes, but with want. Longing clung to every corner, every glance, every sigh. For the cowboy, stepping through those doors was not an act of indulgence. It was one of quiet desperation. The bar was the first stop, a long plank of stained pine, sticky with old beer and stories. The bartender, often a former brawler with a cauliflower ear and a shotgun beneath the counter, served drinks without questions. The whiskey was sharp, cheap, and often laced with who knew what to stretch the bottle. Yet it warmed the belly. It softened the ache behind the eyes. It dulled the memories of wind-chapped solitude. Some cowboys sat silent at the bar, nursing their drinks, eyes glazed. Others played cards, faro, poker, monte, games learned in a dozen towns, with rules that shifted like desert wind. Coins were lost in handfuls. Some gambled their spurs, their coats, even their saddles. For many, their entire month's wages vanished before midnight. Fights were common, some over money, some over accusations of cheating. Others began over something as small as a spilled drink or a look held too long. Tempers, stretched thin by weeks of hunger and dust, snapped easily. Fists flew, bottles shattered, pistols were drawn more often than fired, but now and then a shot rang out, and someone had to be carried out, or not at all. And then there were the women, painted faces, tight corsets, forced smiles. The saloon girls moved through the crowd, like flickers of candlelight, each one practiced in the art of illusion. To the cowboy, they were dreams made flesh, laughter in the dark, perfume that masked the stench of cattle and sweat. Their touch, though fleeting, was often the first gentle contact a man had felt in months. Some cowboys fell in love with them, or thought they did. They whispered promises over warm laps and shared secrets they had never spoken aloud. But love was not what these women sold. They sold moments, soft words, the illusion of being seen, heard, wanted. When the morning came, they belonged to the saloon once more, and the cowboy rode out alone, heart aching from another borrowed night. There were exceptions, stories of true affection, of cowboys and saloon girls who left together, built lives on the edge of wilderness. But they were rare. Rarer still were those who endured. Most romances faded with the dawn, blurred by whiskey and distance. The saloon was a place of release, yes, but also of erosion. It took from the cowboy more than it gave. What began as laughter often ended in silence. What started as celebration ended in loss, of money, of dignity, sometimes of blood. And yet, they returned, again and again. Why? Because on the trail, there was only the dust, the herd, the silence. No music, no human touch, no faces lit by lantern light. In the saloon, a man could pretend he was more than a cog in the great grating wheel of the West. He could drink like a gentleman, flirt like a hero, gamble like a king. He could feel, for a few hours, like someone whole. Even the older cowboys, the ones who knew better, found themselves drawn to those doors. They sat in corners, eyes narrowed, watching the younger men stumble through their first illusions. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they wept. More often, they simply watched, remembering the nights when it had all felt real. Some avoided the saloon entirely. They stayed in the stables or on the edge of town, unwilling to spend their hard-earned pay on lies and liquor. But even they felt the pull. Even they stared toward those windows from afar, imagining the warmth, the noise, the comfort. It wasn't about drink, or women, or even the game. It was about not being alone, even in a crowd of strangers, even for a few hours. The saloon was not salvation. It was reprieve. A brief, flickering candle in the cowboy's long, dark night. And though he always left poorer, more bruised, more tired, he also left knowing that for just a little while, the cold had lifted, the silence had broken, and the world had seemed, if only barely, bearable. In the tales sung around campfires and etched into the pages of yellowed dime novels, the cowboy and the outlaw are often cast as opposites. One wears white, the other black. One stands for justice, the other for chaos. But real life on the trail was seldom that tidy. In the dust-blown towns and the wide, empty spaces in between, the line between cowboy and criminal blurred and often disappeared altogether. For the cowboy, danger rarely came with a warning. It did not always announce itself with a drawn gun or a mask pulled low. Often, it rode beside him, shared his fire, drank from the same bottle. In a world where identities were thin and trust thinner, a cowboy never truly knew the man at his side. They might call each other pardner, share a joke, save each other's life in a river crossing. And still, one could kill the other when gold, fear, or pride demanded it. The West was not policed in any real sense. Sheriffs, when they existed, were often political figures, outgunned, outnumbered, or corrupt. Justice was doled out unevenly, often violently, and sometimes not at all. Vigilantism reigned, and the mob's rope hung just as easily for the innocent as the guilty. Cowboys knew this, and most avoided towns when trouble brewed. Yet trouble followed them. Cattle drives moved through lawless regions where the only authority was that which could be enforced at the end of a gun. Rustlers, land squatters, claim, jumpers and former soldiers turned highwaymen stalked the trails, watching, waiting. A drive meant profit. Profit meant targets. Ambushes were real. So were disappearances. Cowboys sometimes rode out with a group and returned with fewer men. Their absence explained with shrugs and silence. But the most insidious danger lay not in ambushes or skirmishes, but in the subtle betrayal of familiarity. Because anyone could be an outlaw. A man might have a price on his head in Kansas and ride unbothered in Arizona. His name changed, his accent softened. Some had killed in duels. Others had robbed stagecoaches or shot a lawman in a drunken brawl. There were cowboys who had worn both hats, who had been ranch hands one year and bank robbers the next, driven not by malice but by hunger, debt, or despair. There were also those who turned to the trail to escape their pasts, men fleeing the wreckage of lives they could no longer bear, gamblers, deserters, failed farmers, even accused murderers who had never killed a soul. They rode with the same weariness, the same calloused hands, the same need to vanish. The cowboys' world did not ask questions. It did not demand proof of virtue. If a man could ride, rope, and hold his own in the saddle, he was welcome. His past was buried beneath his boots. But that didn't mean it stayed there. Rumors moved faster than cattle. A slip of the tongue, a scar noticed, a certain way of holding a gun, and suddenly tension crept into the camp. Eyes narrowed, weapons stayed closer at hand. Men kept their backs to the wall, their voices low. The air thickened with the possibility of violence. Most cowboys learned early how to read the signs. The rider who never removed his hat. The man who slept too lightly. The one who kept too close to his gear, who asked too many questions or none at all. But knowing the signs did not mean avoiding the danger, because when trouble came, it often came fast, and from someone once called friend. Disputes flared over money, horses, women, pride. The triggers were simple, the outcomes final. A fistfight might turn into a shooting. A poker hand might end in blood. Some men killed and ran. Others killed and stayed, daring anyone to challenge their version of events. Most times, there were no trials, just the slow, reluctant nod of the remaining men. It's over. Let's ride. And yet, There was a strange code among cowboys, unwritten but deeply felt. Don't steal from your crew. Don't abandon a man in danger. Don't shoot first unless you aim to finish. These were the laws that mattered, not because they were noble, but because they kept the herd together, the job moving, the body count lower. Still, these rules were broken, and when they were, the consequences rippled. A man killed another on the trail. The killer was exiled, left behind with his horse and gear, but stripped of comradeship. Few fates were harsher, for to be alone in the vast West was not freedom, it was a sentence. It meant no help if you fell, no witness if you died. Some turned to outlaw life not by choice, but by force, branded a thief unjustly, accused of a killing they did not commit, run out of town for nothing more than bad luck. These men carried bitterness beneath their coats and suspicion in their eyes. The cowboy might ride beside them, unsure if he rode with a victim or a villain. And yet, despite all this, brotherhood sometimes bloomed. Out of hardship, trust formed. One man saved another in a stampede, pulled him from floodwaters, fought beside him against rustlers. In such moments, the cowboy saw not the outlaw or the stranger, but the man. The one who bled, who feared, who hoped for something better. And that bond, however fragile, sometimes endured. But it was never safe. In the West, no face was fixed, no name secure. Today's ally could be tomorrow's betrayer, and so the cowboy rode with caution, not just through storm and wilderness, but through friendship itself. He kept one hand near the reins, one eye on the shadows, because even under the same stars, not all who rode beside him wished him well. And when a gun was drawn in the dark, and a voice whispered a name no longer used, the cowboy remembered. The most dangerous enemies were the ones who once sat by your fire. Out on the open range, the most feared dangers were often loud, the stampede, the gunshot, the thunderclap of an approaching storm. But beneath these sharp alarms lurked a quieter, crueler threat, the slow onset of sickness. It came without warning, without drama. It settled into the bones like a whisper, and grew, day by day, until even the strongest rider could no longer lift himself into the saddle. For cowboys, illness was not an event. It was a process, a long, dragging erosion of strength, appetite, and spirit. And there were no doctors on the trail, no hospitals, no pharmacies stocked with clean syringes and measured vials. A man could break a bone and still ride, but a fever, that most silent of predators, could bring him to his knees without shedding a single drop of blood. The ailments were many: dysentery, consumption, influenza, rheumatism, malaria, abscessed teeth. The common cold, untreated and persistent, could turn to pneumonia. A small cut left unattended could fester, blacken, and steal a limb. A chill night soaked through with sweat could spark a cough that never left. And the cowboy, exhausted, underfed, and exposed to every element, was vulnerable in ways he never spoke aloud. The symptoms were often ignored at first: a sore throat, a tightening in the chest, a nagging pain in the gut. But with each mile, each restless night, each missed meal, the illness deepened. And still, he rode. He had to. There was no pause, no rest, no sickbed waiting beneath a roof. The herd moved, and the cowboy with it. His comrades might notice, might offer a tighter scarf, a bit of hot coffee, a quiet word. But there were no real remedies. At best, a man could be wrapped in blankets near the fire and given some whiskey, perhaps a tin of beans if he could keep it down. Some chewed willow bark for fever. Others made teas from prairie herbs, taught by native scouts or passed from older hands. A few tricks worked, most did not. And so, the illness spread within him, carving away his strength like termites in a beam. When a man could no longer sit upright in the saddle, he became a burden. Few said it aloud, but all felt it. One less hand to help with the drive, one more risk to manage, And yet, few cowboys abandoned the sick. They did what they could. Tied a man to his horse if he could no longer grip the reins, built makeshift litters between mounts, gave up their own blankets to keep him warm. But the range was not merciful. If the fever climbed too high, if the breathing grew shallow, if the man began to speak in delirium, calling out to long-dead loved ones or reciting half-remembered prayers, the end was close. And when it came, it was usually in silence. There were no vigils, no priest, just a shallow grave dug beneath a cottonwood or on a rise of dry earth. A hat placed over the face. A few words, if someone could speak them. A name, perhaps. Or just, he rode well. Then the dust covered him, and the trail moved on. In some rare cases, the sick man recovered. He sweated through the fever, held on through the worst nights, and woke with clarity. But even then, recovery was not full. Weight was lost. Stamina gone. A cough lingered for months. Some men never rode the same again. Their strength had gone like smoke in the wind. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, was especially cruel. It began with a cough. Just a cough. But it deepened, wore down the lungs, and brought with it blood. Men coughed into rags they kept hidden. They pretended not to see the stains. They rode until they couldn't. And then they died, one breath at a time, chest hollow, eyes sunken. Dental pain was another slow torment. Teeth cracked from grit in food or from age. Gums swelled. Abscesses formed. The pain was constant, pulsing, like a second heartbeat. There were no dentists on the trail. A man might pull his own tooth with pliers, or beg a friend to do it for him. Whiskey numbed the flesh. Sometimes. Infection, however, often followed. And it spread. There were also wounds left by the trail itself. Saddle sores turned septic, rope burns infected with dirt, broken bones that never set right. Arthritis set in early, hands curled with it. Knees refused to bend. Ankles swelled. A man of 30 might move like one twice his age. Mental illness, though never named, crept. Alongside the physical, the trail wore at the soul. Prolonged isolation, suppressed grief, and relentless hardship carved into the mind. Some men grew quiet and withdrawn. Others snapped, suddenly violent or inconsolable. Some wandered off, never to return. Their minds had gone where their bodies could not follow. Cowboys had no language for depression, no patience for despair, but they felt it. In themselves, in each other. They saw it in the slumped shoulders, the distant eyes, the sudden outbursts. It was not weakness. It was the price of survival. And through it all, there was no reprieve. The cowboy rode sick. He rode tired. He rode with cracked ribs, swollen gums, coughing blood into his scarf. He rode because stopping meant nothingness, because the drive was all there was, because death on the trail was less frightening than being left behind. There was a grim nobility in that persistence, not heroism exactly, but endurance. The quiet, uncelebrated courage of the man who rose despite the pain, who smiled despite the rot in his gut, who reached for the reins one more time. So when we remember the cowboy, let us not imagine only the strength of his arm or the steadiness of his aim. Let us remember too the fever in his veins, the swelling in his joints, the cough that shook him in the dark. Let us remember how he suffered, and how, in that suffering, he kept riding, because there was no other choice. The American frontier stretched endlessly westward, a land of vast promise and unforgiving silence. And across its rolling plains and jagged hills, between creeks that whispered through cottonwoods and mountains that caught the light like swords, were the graves. Small, rough, and often unmarked, forgotten depressions in the earth, stones placed in haste, wood crosses splintered by time. The cowboy's final resting place was rarely chosen. More often it was claimed by chance, carved into the soil where his strength ran out. Death on the trail was not theatrical. It did not come with grand speeches or gathered kin. It came suddenly or slowly, but always alone. One moment a man was coughing or limping or pale in the saddle. The next, he was still. Whether by bullet, disease, accident, or weather, the result was the same. The trail would not wait. The herd moved. The job went on. And the body had to be laid down quickly, respectfully if possible, but always efficiently. There were no cemeteries out there. No undertakers, no marble stones etched with kind words. The cowboy's grave was dug with shovels or the back of an axe, hands blistered and clumsy from fatigue. If the ground was too hard or frozen, they used what they had, scraping earth with knives, breaking roots with boot heels, building cairns from loose rock. Most graves were shallow. The men could not linger. Wolves circled. Coyotes watched. The herd might be moving, or a storm might be brewing on the horizon. They worked quickly, wrapped the body in a blanket or coat if one could be spared, folded hands, covered eyes. Some placed his hat over his chest. Others set it atop the mound of earth. If a cross was made, it was often of 2 branches tied with rope or twine. Initials were scratched into bark. A stone might bear a name, hastily carved with a belt knife. But often there was no time, no tools, no certainty of spelling. And so the marker was simple, a shape in the land, a mound just high enough to be remembered. For a while, the men said what words they could. Sometimes a prayer, sometimes silence. Occasionally a song, a cowboy ballad sung low, trembling with dust and grief. There were no elegies, no orators, just men standing with hats in hand, eyes downcast, thinking of their own end and how it might come just as sudden, just as quiet. Then they mounted and rode on. They had to. The herd did not pause for grief. Neither did the sky. The trail was long and the hours short. And so the cowboy's death, like his life, was passed by, acknowledged with a nod, and then left behind, vanishing into the swell of memory. Those who survived remembered the places: a lone cottonwood where a friend was buried, a bluff overlooking a river where a boy too young for such labor had slipped from his horse. They remembered the sound of the shovel in the earth, the way the wind had picked up right after, the feeling in their stomach when they realized how little marked a man's end. In the years that followed, settlers sometimes found these graves. Children playing in the grass stumbled across rotting boards or piles of stone. Ranchers fenced off areas with no names, unsure of what lay beneath. Some were disturbed by accident or by greed, hoping for buried coin. Others were simply lost, swallowed by the land. The cowboy knew this would happen. He knew that death out there meant being forgotten, not because his life didn't matter, but because the trail could not afford to stop. Because there were no records, because no one kept lists of who had ridden and who had fallen. He was, in many ways, already a ghost, riding toward a future that had no place for his name. And yet, some left tokens behind. A locket buried with the body, a note scrawled in charcoal and tucked into a shirt. A knife passed to a friend with a whispered, "Give this to my brother if you ever make it to El Paso." These small attempts at remembrance were rarely fulfilled, but they meant something. They said, "I was here. I mattered." There were superstitions too. Some cowboys believed in spirits, that the restless dead wandered the plains, that men buried too shallow might rise, that it was bad luck to leave a comrade uncovered or unblessed. And so, even in haste, most tried to show respect, not out of religion necessarily, but out of shared understanding. Today it was him, tomorrow it might be me. The harshest truth was that many who died were never found at all. A rider separated from the herd, a man who wandered sick from camp and collapsed in the brush, a drowning in a river whose current offered no body back. Their names passed in murmurs, then faded. Remember Buck? Whatever happened to him? Don't know. Last I saw he was heading toward the mesa. Never came back. Their stories ended not with graves, but with unanswered questions. And so, the land became a graveyard of sorts, 1,000 little rises in the dirt, 1,000 names unspoken. The bones of cowboys mingled with the dust they once rode through, as uncelebrated in death as they had been in life. Yet in this forgetting, there was a strange kind of peace. Because the cowboy had never asked to be remembered with parades or plaques. He asked only for decency, for the earth to take him gently, for someone, even one, to pause a moment before moving on. And in the quiet that followed each burial, when the hoofbeats had faded and the wind moved softly through the grass, perhaps the land did remember. In its way, a slight dip in the earth, a weathered stone, the hush of a place where someone had once stood and whispered, "Ride easy now, friend." In the dusty wake of hoofbeats and under the boundless dome of the western sky, there stirred within the cowboy a voice not always spoken, a longing not always named. Beneath his hardened exterior, beneath the grit, beneath his fingernails, the sunburn on his neck, and the silence that wrapped around his long days, there dwelled something softer, something tender, a music untrained, uncelebrated, and all too often unheard. The world did not expect poetry from a cowboy. It expected calloused hands, sharp eyes, a rifle that stayed true, and a back that didn't break under the weight of miles. It did not expect that same man to hum melodies into the wind, to sing lullabies to cattle in the dark, to scratch verse into the soft bark of cottonwoods. And yet, he did. He sang when no one asked him to. He sang because silence, however vast, was heavy, because to live every day with dust in your mouth and loneliness in your heart demanded a place to set your burdens. And if the fire wouldn't burn them, and the whiskey wouldn't drown them, then maybe, just maybe, a song would carry them away. These songs were not written on paper. They were born in motion, in the sway of the saddle, in the rhythm of hooves, in the long exhale after a climb, and the slow creak of leather before sleep. They came from memory, from sorrow, from a longing too wide to name. The cowboy didn't need an audience. His stage was the prairie, and the stars his only spotlight. He sang for the herd, for the night, for the wind that carried his voice far past the flicker of the campfire. Sometimes he sang for the cattle themselves, low, even tones, drawn from the belly and smoothed by years of solitude. These night songs weren't artful in the classical sense. They were murmured, half-remembered, stretched into endless verses, often invented on the spot. But they worked. The herd calmed beneath his melody. He calmed. The cattle weren't the only ones soothed. A cowboy riding night guard might hum through a chill wind, his scarf pulled tight, his coat buttoned high, the world around him dark and shivering. He'd watch the herd shift in the moonlight, and he'd hum not for beauty, but for company. Not for performance, but to fill the hollow that widened inside him with every mile he traveled. Others were more deliberate. Some carried harmonicas in their pockets, dented and well-loved. They played alone by the fire or shared their tunes with a quiet audience after supper, their fingers stiff from rope burns, their breath tinged with wood smoke and whiskey. On rare occasions, one might have a fiddle, a precious thing, wrapped carefully in blankets, played with reverence. The music was never polished, never grand, but it had something truer than perfection. It had honesty. Some men composed verses in their heads, turning trail dust into metaphors, turning heartbreak into rhythm. These weren't written down, not out of fear, but because there was simply no need. The cowboy didn't write to be remembered. He wrote to remember. He wrote because the ache inside him needed a shape, and once shaped, it could be carried. The themes of these songs were predictable, but never tired. The girl he left behind, the home that no longer waited, the friend buried near the Pecos, the storm he rode through alone, the horse he lost, the drink that dulled everything but regret. They were songs of survival, but not triumph, songs of softness, sung by those who had no softness left to give, save for these fragile refrains. There was no judgment among cowboys when it came to singing. Even the hardest men, the fiercest bronc-busters, the sharpest-eyed marksmen, would go quiet when a song rose over the camp. They'd pull their hats low, stare into the fire, and let it wash over them. Not because they were sentimental, but because they knew. They understood. In a life where words were rationed and feelings buried beneath the day's work, a song could say everything a man couldn't. It didn't matter if the voice cracked. It didn't matter if the rhythm faltered. What mattered was that it was true. But these songs didn't survive. They weren't recorded. They faded as the men did, swept into the same silence from which they rose. Historians would later recreate them, polish them, fit them into museums and soundtracks. But the originals, the real songs, the ones sung under a new moon by a man too tired to stand, those are gone. Gone, too, are the whispered lyrics scratched into tree bark, the poems muttered into the wind, the half-sung ballads that floated above cattle heads as the herd settled into sleep. Lost not because they weren't good, but because they weren't meant to stay. And perhaps that is what made them beautiful. They were gifts given to the night, to the wind, to the ghosts who walked beside the cowboy but never spoke. They were farewells and prayers and apologies. And though no one clapped when they ended, though no one wrote them down, they lingered in the dust, in the folds of saddle blankets, in the spaces between hoofbeats. So when we remember the cowboy, let us remember not just his silence, but his song. Not just the man who never cried, but the man who sang so he wouldn't have to. Because even the roughest hands have hearts. And sometimes the only way to hold them is to listen, quietly, to the song that no one else hears. The story of the American cowboy often ends in a blaze of cinematic triumph. A gun raised, a ride into the sunset, a sense of purpose fulfilled. But for the real men who rode the trails, who bled beneath the sun and shivered beneath the stars, the truth was quieter, lonelier, and far less kind. The end did not come with glory. It came with fading, with fences, with forgetting. By the final decades of the 19th century, the world the cowboy had known began to disappear beneath his feet. It did not vanish all at once. It eroded slowly, like a river eating away at its banks. Each year, another ranch enclosed its land with barbed wire. Another stretch of open range was claimed, closed, cut into parcels. Where once the cowboy roamed freely across endless plains, now he found locked gates and no trespassing signs. Railroads reached deeper into the frontier, bringing cattle closer to market with steel and steam. The long drives, once the lifeblood of cowboy labor, became rare, then obsolete. There was no need to ride hundreds of miles with a herd when a train could do it faster and cheaper. And so, the cowboy, once the very heartbeat of the cattle economy, was left adrift. Some adapted. They became ranch hands, working fenced pastures instead of open trail. But it was not the same. The rhythm changed. The days were shorter. The rides fewer, the land smaller. There was more routine, more structure, more oversight. And always, less pay. Others drifted to towns, hoping for steadier work, hauling freight, building fences, wrangling horses for circuses or rodeos. Some found employment with the very railroads that had made them unnecessary, but many could not make the shift. They were not made for walls or clocks. They had spent too long in motion, too many years under the sky. These men, proud, stubborn, rootless, became shadows. You could see them leaning against saloon walls, boots scuffed, hats pulled low. You could hear their voices in the back corners of bar rooms, telling stories no one wanted to hear anymore. They smelled of horse sweat and loneliness. The world moved on, and they did not. The cowboys' decline did not inspire headlines. No one wept when the last drive crossed the Pecos. No parades were held for the men who buried friends beneath cottonwoods and sang songs to keep cattle calm. Their passing was quiet, gradual, unnoticed by a country already obsessed with cities, industry, and speed. Some tried to preserve what remained. They competed in early rodeos, displaying their skills before curious crowds. Roping contests, bronc riding, trick shooting. These performances became echoes of a life that had once been lived daily, but even these became pageant more than preservation. The cowboy was now entertainment, a symbol, not a man, and so began the myth. Novelists and filmmakers picked up the image of the cowboy, polished it, painted it in broad strokes. They stripped away the grime, the pain, the exhaustion. They gave him clear morals, a silver star, a clean shave. They gave him victories. They gave him endings. But the real cowboy had neither. There were no rewards for a life spent under sun and sky, no pensions, no family waiting at the homestead. Most cowboys never married. They had few possessions, fewer savings. When they grew, too old to ride, they were dismissed. When they became sick or crippled, they were left behind. Some died in bunkhouses, unknown and unclaimed. Others faded into the margins of growing towns, working odd jobs, sleeping in alleys. Their hands still bore the calluses, their boots still creaked with dust, but their purpose, clear once, was now gone. And yet, they did not ask for pity. They had never expected gratitude. They had lived hard because the world had demanded it. Because something in them, pride, restlessness, duty, had chosen that. Life, again and again. Even as it failed to choose them in return. There is a melancholy in that truth. A dignity too. Because the cowboy was not a hero in the way legends suggest. He was a worker, a wanderer. A man who gave more to the land than it ever gave back. He did not shape history in grand sweeps. He lived it in inches, in miles, in days where the wind never stopped and the trail never ended. And in the end, when his saddle was stored, when his horse was sold, when his name was no longer spoken on the drive, there was no parade, only a room in a boarding house, only the sound of rain on a tin roof, only the memory of long rides under stars now clouded by smoke and progress. But perhaps, in that final silence, there was peace. Not the peace of recognition, but the peace of having lived truly, close to the land, close to the sky, close to the edge of things. And though the world may have moved on, the cowboy rode on in spirit, in story, in every gust of prairie wind that still whispers his song. When the dust of the last cattle drive settled and the twilight of the open range descended, a strange alchemy began. The real cowboy, worn thin by wind and time, was quietly laid to rest by history. But from the fading embers of his world, a new figure emerged, bigger than life, cleaner than truth, and destined not for the saddle, but the silver screen. The Hollywood cowboy was born. He did not crawl out of the mud beside a dying steer, nor did he limp through the snow in cracked boots. He leapt, fully formed, from the imaginations of directors and writers who had never ridden a mile in silence. He was tall and handsome, always sure of his aim and purpose. His hat was white, his horse loyal, and his smile unburdened. He didn't mumble through toothaches or bury his sorrow in dusty hymns. He bantered with outlaws, saved school teachers, and solved every problem with a six-shooter or a lasso. To millions, this was the cowboy. And for a while, even those who had once lived the life began to believe the image. How could they not? Films painted a world where the West was wild but tameable, where danger was exciting, and where every conflict resolved cleanly before sunset. These cowboys didn't grow old, they didn't fall ill, they didn't die alone with their boots still on. But the real cowboy had known different. He had known the ache of cold joints after too many nights on frozen ground. He had known the weight of burying friends with no stone to mark their rest. He had known hunger that gnawed, solitude that scalded, and a future that offered nothing but another trail to ride. There had been no camera to record his triumphs, no applause when he survived another season, no parade when he hung up his reins. Yet somehow, it was the myth that endured. In the 20th century, the image of the cowboy galloped through America's collective dreamscape. Film studios churned out westerns by the hundreds. Names like Tom Mix, Roy Rogers, and John Wayne became household words, shaping how generations understood the West. They created a cowboy who never bled unless it was noble, never lost unless it was heroic, and never wept, ever. Television continued the trend. Weekly serials brought the cowboy into living rooms across the country. He was now a family man, a community protector, a lawman with a heart of gold. His clothes were always clean, his words always true. He shot straight, spoke plainly, and lived simply. But it was all curated, carefully constructed to comfort rather than confront. There were benefits, of course. These stories kept the West alive in the public imagination. They inspired interest, tourism, even a sort of national identity rooted in self-reliance and justice. But they also washed away complexity. They made the cowboy into a symbol rather than a man. And so, the real story was buried. Gone were the songs sung to cattle in the cold. Gone were the tales of loneliness, of rustlers who looked like friends, of nights when even the stars felt indifferent. Gone were the broken teeth, the swollen knees, the letters never sent home. In their place was a fantasy, a bright, clean tale of heroism and grit without cost. But those who had ridden the true trails knew better. Some old cowboys lived long enough to see their lives fictionalized, their hardship turned into spectacle. They sat in dark theaters and watched themselves rewritten. They watched actors draw pistols with flair, leap from saddles with grace, and smile through violence as if it were sport. Some laughed. Some stayed silent. A few wept, not because they were angry, but because the truth had been made so easy. The real cowboy had no theme music, no scripted victory. He endured not for glory, but because he had no other choice. And when he fell, there was no slow-motion finish, just the hush of boots in the dust, and the silence of a world that did not pause to notice. Yet even in its distortion, the myth contained glimmers of truth. The courage, real. The resilience, undeniable. The love of open land, of sky that never ended, of a world stripped bare of pretense. All of that was true. The Hollywood cowboy may have polished the image, but the bones belonged to someone real, someone who once rode alone, singing into the dark so he wouldn't vanish inside it. There is a strange tenderness in this contradiction. The myth both erases and honors. It forgets the man, but remembers his silhouette. It softens his calluses, but not his stance. It lies, yes, but it lies in longing, for strength, for honesty, for simplicity. And perhaps the real tragedy is not that the Hollywood cowboy exists, but that he stands alone. Rarely does he share the screen with the tired version, the coughing one, the one who still hears the wind calling across graves without names. Rarely does he give voice to the man who sang not for applause, but for survival. So let us remember both. Let us keep the myth, for dreams matter and stories can soothe. But let us carve out space too, for the man who wore no cape, who spoke little, who asked for nothing except a chance to keep riding. Let us place, beside the gallant figure of the Hollywood hero, the shadow of the forgotten one. The one with dust in his teeth and sorrow in his stride. Because the cowboy was never just legend. He was flesh and ache and song. And though he may have vanished from the trail, his truth still rides, soft as a whisper, steady as hoofbeats, real as the land he once called home. In the silence that follows history's loudest chapters, there are always those left behind, men who gave themselves to a moment that vanished before anyone thought to write their names down. The cowboys of the old American West were such men, not kings nor conquerors, not writers nor priests, but ordinary souls who bore the weight of an extraordinary land. And when they passed, they left behind not monuments, but whispers, faint traces in the dust, caught in the folds of time. Their lives were not recorded in journals of fame, nor preserved in family photo albums. Most of them died as they lived, quietly, with little ceremony, far from home, and without applause. But the earth remembers, the sky remembers, and if one listens long enough to the wind that runs through the high grass, one may yet hear them. Not their words. Those are long gone. But the feeling of them, the feeling of a man who rose with the dawn, not because he wanted to, but because someone had to. The feeling of a rider hunched against the wind, pushing on not for reward, but because stopping meant surrender. The feeling of men who shared no great philosophy, only a mutual understanding. Endure. Their world was built from small things. The hiss of a campfire, the quiet creak of leather, the scent of worn saddlebags and river dust, the weight of tools well used and rarely replaced. These men didn't speak in flourishes. Their language was movement, and their beliefs were formed in silence. They trusted few things: their horse, their instincts, and the land. Though even the land betrayed them from time to time. Many never made it to old age. Disease, accident, or poverty saw to that. The few who did were often forgotten, their stories dismissed as relics, their truths folded under the smoother pages of history. They died in bunkhouses, in poorhouses, or alone under cold stars. Their graves, if marked at all, bore no testament to their struggle, only names carved with trembling hands, first names, sometimes only initials, a cross, a pile of stones. But this was never what they rode for. They rode not for legacy, but for survival. Not for praise, but for the simple dignity of finishing what they started. They bore the years like a yoke and the loneliness like a badge. When others left, they stayed. When the snow fell, they kept watch. When the trails stretched endlessly ahead, they set their jaw and pressed on. And in this, there was something sacred. Because though they owned little, though the world passed them, by with increasingly hurried footsteps, they had known something most never would. The true shape of endurance. They knew the sound of a calf's first breath on a bitter night. They knew the colour of dawn on a frost-covered plain. They knew what it meant to share silence with another man and still feel seen. Their memory does not live in statues or textbooks. It lives in the way a horse flicks its ears in tall grass, in the smell of old leather, in the firelight flickering against the rough grain of a log wall. It lives in every song hummed without words, every mile walked because the horse gave out, but the job was not yet done. And though the cowboy was often mythologized, painted in broad strokes of heroism or caricature, none of that myth carried the weight of the truth. The truth was humbler, more fragile, more beautiful. The truth was this: they mattered. Not because they changed the world, but because they bore it, quietly, completely, without asking for reward or recognition. They lived on the edge of civilization, where the maps ran out and hardship began, and there they carved out something strong, not with pen or sword, but with presence. Even now, long after their boots have crumbled and their saddles are dry with age, they are with us, in spirit, in soil, in memory. They ride not in films, but in the back corners of our minds when we pass an open field at dusk. They sit beside us in the hush between songs. They linger in the stories we tell when we need to remember what strength looks like. Not loud, not violent, but still. So let us not forget them. Let us speak of them not as myths, but as men. Let us remember their names, even if we must invent them. Let us build in our hearts the markers that time erased from the plains. And let us carry forward their quiet way of being, enduring, honest, and ever facing the wind. For in the end, the cowboy's truest legacy was not the gun, or the rope, or the trail. It was the whisper. A whisper that says, I was here. I did what was needed. I rode through storms. I loved the land. I kept going, even when no one saw. And if we are listening, truly listening, we will hear it. Not with our ears, but with our bones. a sound as soft as boots on dry soil. A breath, a song, a whisper from the dust.